want to say, much to my horror, I had these words reversed in my original title, and I thought, I did do that. Okay, so I changed it back. I think I had botanical century. I don't know where that came from. But anyway, it's been straightened out. And we're going to, let me go ahead and put the goal up here. I'd like to start off with the goal to provide geovisualizations and really other methods and the basic analytics of this, of various 19th century botanical communities of practice, which of course started in the United States when I started looking at this. And I took a quick detour to Ireland, where the first female botanist was, and this was like 200 years ago. I'll show you a little bit about that. And, oops.
Keep talking.
Okay, keep talking. Okay. So the plan is to provide, again, geovisualizations. I have maps and so on, or I create maps from these networks. And these will show, these geovisualizations, these relationships between spatial and social networks. Okay? But it's a very dynamic process, and it's really never completed. There's always room for continuing interpretations and iterations and so on. And one of the big questions that emerges is, how are these related to the development of places, communities arising from the interaction of network actors? Okay, meaning it could be botanists, illustrators, what have you. Okay, so my outline, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about how I got into this. And then we'll talk a little bit about the natural history and science at the beginning of the long 19th century, which dates from 1789 to 1914, the French Revolution up to World War I. Okay, it's considered the long 19th century, characterized by revolutions and the Industrial Revolution and the rising middle class. And then talk a little bit about spatial and social networks and geography, and how they are geography, and some of the methods, networks, and a program that I use, Gephi, and it's not the only one, it's an open source program, and how we can follow botanical and naturalist actors. Really, you can follow any kind of person, but that's what we're focused on, and some of the materials used, and some of the results. And in this, I did use Claude AI quite a bit, and I just sort of put that as a caveat. What I use AI is to get started. Okay, it's kind of like a research assistant. Go find this or that, these kind of people, and so on. And it does, it provides me a list, which I can then proceed to look up, find more about, or whether Claude is lying to me or not, and so on. So this curiosity, this idea about gardens as place, or what's the historical background of that. I was in Longwood Gardens way back in 2008, and I was looking through the bookstore, and there were all these books about, these collectors, okay, that had gone out in the field over time and brought all these things back. So it's like you're bringing back all this materials to this one place. Okay, so I'm thinking, gardens could be kind of a place. At that time, I was working as a research associate in North Carolina. I kept that in my mind, and then looked through some of the journey of ideas, plants and fungi as objects moving in space. These things are circulating in space at one time or another. Okay, information flow, yes, but also specimens are circulating, and ideas are circulating at the time as well. And then we can, maybe you've heard of Bruno Latour, but the idea of tracing this movement, this idea of tracing the process of science over time and space, and this lends itself pretty easily to this concept of networks. And why, or people ask me this, why are you doing that? There's more important things to look at, but this we can get at looking at formation of new knowledge, how it's formed, okay, and past environmental conditions. Okay. People write about what was it like in these places 200 years ago, what kinds of soils, what kinds of plants we had in this area, and so forth. And phenology, which is also very important, especially with climate warming, right? When do plants flowering comes about, can affect insects and pollinators and so on. They could miss the primary flowering time for certain kinds of plants and so on, and they, can have an effect on their populations. And then, so yes, the origins, extinction, and then want to come across that here. Reading about, I heard about this a while ago, but it was actually from people that had been here a while ago, these acclimatization societies, okay, that is bringing over all these flora and fauna, basically, from Europe, England, and acclimatizing to a new environment. And so that sounds, it was, for economic reasons and, colonization and so on, but that could lead to certain problems that we nowadays experience. For example, invasive species and so forth. And then what are the role of amateurs, okay, today in, extirpation and restoration? I will talk about that at the very end. And the role of amateurs, such as modern citizen science activities, okay, which I'll show an example of, and the social relations among agents within the network. Okay, a lot of this, again, is all started up by asking questions of AI, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude AI. All right, so it just so happens, okay, when I was the GIS manager at the State Center for Health Statistics in North Carolina, I was staying with my father, who lived in Hillsborough, North Carolina, which was the old capital of North Carolina. So really nice architecture there and so on. And so one of my, I don't know if I call it a hobby, but one thing I like to do is walk through cemeteries and do kind of, look at who's related to who and, when they died and so forth. And so I did this kind of thing, and then I came across a fellow that I had met while I was walking in taking a tour of the Natural Science Museum in Raleigh, North Carolina, spending a lunch break there or whatever. And so I thought, well, I know where that guy is, okay? He's buried behind the Episcopal Church in where my dad lives. And so that's where he is, along with his family members. And with that is a plaque commemorating his contributions to plants and fungi and so on, the knowledge of like over 4,000 species identified just in the region, okay? And you wonder, how much time did these people have to do these kinds of things, right? I mean, what was they must have had day jobs, right? Well, he was a minister, Episcopal priest, okay? But again, you think, well, they didn't have the same kind of distractions, maybe television or anything like that. So maybe they had that kind of time. Plus, oftentimes they had servants and in many cases slaves working for them as well. So this is how I got started on this. I was curious about this. And so moving on, why do people collect, by the way? Right? So collecting as routine human behavior. Everybody seems to have something they collect, right? If you think about it, I'm collecting collectors right now, okay? And so I went through this, I go, there's gotta be literature on this, So I don't know if I use Claude or whatever, but there's a text reference, Kathleen Rasuli and Stanley Hollander's outline in this text. Several things. Is it an extension of self in some way? Some kind of psychological thing, maybe? Relation to others, maybe it's club, okay? And then financial investment, if you're collecting antiques, coins, whatever, or even plants for that matter, rare plants. Is it an addiction or a compulsion? Hoarding, maybe, okay? You just can't, my wife put I had 12 aquariums at one time, and she's, that's ridiculous, Jim. Of course, now she buys every plant she can see, and it's, so we all have these kinds of things. And some people, it's a preservation, a continuity of history. Okay, they're doing it for that reason. Maybe they're real interested in regional or local history, that kind of thing. And a great book, okay, written not too long ago, is called The Cactus Hunters. Desire and Extinction, the Illicit Succulent Trade, Cactuses, and so on, by Jared Margulis. And it's all about the sort of negative side of collecting, basically illicit trade, okay, criminals out there. Things that are common in one area become a big hit in a place like South Korea. And so there's this financial motivation to start shipping this at one time common cactus, and now it's becoming rare in its original location because of this demand for this common cactus. So it's no longer so common in one area. So, I mean, there's lots of stories about this, okay? Some selling jail time, prison time, and they go right back at it when they get out. Okay, and so let's continue on with background. Here's a new word, okay? Prosopography, okay? And new to me anyway, and it's basically a method, all right, for a research approach, basically. And you're focusing on the external material, individual characteristics of people. Okay, it's kind of superficial in that way, okay? And you're interested in the common or the average, the everyday. And it's an aid, they claim it's an aid in sociographic research, but what I'm interested in is more as like a collective biography, which they also mentioned, that groups that have something in common, whether they're botanists, collectors, or what have you, okay? There's a term for this, homophily. Okay, it's used both in geography, network, and network science within geography and so forth. All right, and what you're establishing, you're creating this database and a listing of all persons from a specific milieu, all right, defined chronologically and geographically. So you're looking at a particular group of people in time and space, okay, and is visualizable and studied as networks. Okay, so here's another word, cameralism. Okay, I'm going back in history a little bit about the way people thought, okay, approached things at that time. It's a bit different than today. And so this goes back to the middle of the 18th century. It was basically a German economic and administrative philosophy. In other words, you count things, you categorize things, you study things for the benefit of society, okay, and economics, okay? So it could be all kinds of natural objects. So this is before like the Industrial Revolution. So plants and animals really, come into play here. And so if you probably heard, statistics, right? But the original word actually meant not like inferential statistics, but basically like vital statistics. How much of this do we have here? How much do we have of that over there? And so on. It was basically categorizing and studying things for the benefit of the state. Hence the word statistics, so-called, a fellow by the name of Okenball. So the idea was to maximize state power and prosperity. Back then it was more mercantile, okay, not capitalist necessarily, where you're concerned with your exports and imports. Hopefully your exports are greater than imports. Then we had all these population theories and political economists thinking that, population is good. You have a labor force, you have demand, and so on. And this is going on right around the time, if you're familiar with Thomas Malthus, he put a wet blanket on the whole thing, okay, in his essay on population, saying, you keep population growing, you're going to outstrip your resources, basically, okay? And that caused quite a fear right at this time. So population was a big concern. But again, the systematization and careful study and rational management of things. So how does natural history come into it? And as we see here, botanist Richard Schombach, okay, was very much involved in economic botany, okay, and agriculture. He came at a certain time. He came from Germany originally, okay? So they have these ideas about what you can do with these plants and colonization and so forth. And so there's also people also looked at plants, were important for environmental health, or I would say looking at medicinal plants, medical botany, resource surveys, going out there and seeing what you have, okay, especially in a new area, okay, Like in the United States, this was done quite a bit in the Western expansion, that people were sent out to catalog what was out there and so forth and bring things back. In fact, there was one expedition back in the 1830s, the American or the U.S. exploring expedition that went out for a few years, went all over the world collecting thousands upon thousands of specimens. And the name that came up in here is Breckenridge, which we'll see, who comes out to be quite a prominent node in these networks, merely because he had all these specimens and he was distributing them out to everybody, okay, all throughout the world. But there was also going in the United States, this westward movement when you're planning railroads and so on. They would send people out ahead of the railroad to document what was there. Okay, so again, we have classifications, very important to natural historians. Again, it's rational. What colonial applications do we have? Do we understand local and regional flora and fauna and other resources which are essential for effective administration and economic exploitation? That is, there's very practical applications to this. It's just not somebody who likes to collect butterflies or plants and so on, okay, for the reason why they're doing it, which might be a little bit different than today when people involved in natural history. And then there's science. We're almost done with this part here, okay, background. There's this notion of romantic science. I don't know if that seems like an oxymoron in a way, but there is concepts of romantic science. And of course, this stems from the late 18th century on into the 19th century, pretty much throughout the 19th century, at least its influence on science. People like von Humboldt, okay? And Goethe is also associated with this as well. Okay? He was actually fairly much a scientist, all right? But why is this, you know, what do you mean by romantic science? What it's getting down to is you can't know everything. Like in the Enlightenment, it's supposed to be objective, okay? And that, you know, once you could know everything if you had enough time, okay? Objectify things. Okay, but what happens with romantic science is the subject enters into it, okay? And there's philosophers, and I am no philosopher, but starting with Immanuel Kant, this idea of reflexivity, okay, comes about, and especially with the German philosophers are talking about this at this time. And so the end result, okay, is we start thinking about, well, the human being is engaged in this process as well, and from that we get aesthetics, all right, holistic things, art, poetry, and literature. Again, nature's not completely knowable. And Humboldt really spurred things on in the so-called New World, but especially in the United States. And he's very popular. I know he's popular in Europe. He was very popular in the United States as well during the 19th century about this. I mean, you go to any state, you're going to find something named after Humboldt. Okay, and there's also the Humboldt State Polytechnic in California, and so on. Humboldt County, Humboldt Streets, and so on, even like a place like Milwaukee, all right? So these are kind of the big names of that era, and their influence is long felt. And then we have, okay, so let's take another look at natural history. It's observational, empirical, okay? Basically qualitative in nature. Okay? You're describing things, you're categorizing things. But it's also part of the inductive process in the scientific wheel, basically. All right, and then we have natural philosophy at that time, okay, what we think of as science today. The word scientist didn't come about until a little bit later in the 19th century. Anyway, this is where we, you know, our classical ideas about science, like experimental, theoretical, okay, and then from that we can predict, right? It's deductive, okay? So at this time, going back to the early 19th century, maybe, we have few professionals in science. Okay? Hardly anybody would be called a botanist. Maybe a naturalist or teaching medicine, which they would be involved with natural history. All right, but many amateurs, okay, what we call amateurs today, they don't really have any training in it. They might have taken a class in it under the tutelage of somebody at one time. And also at this time, stemming from the period of enlightenment, okay, we have Carl Linnaeus, all right, and he comes out with this binomial system and attempt to rationalize the multitudinous names that plants and animals have, all right? So he comes up with this binomial system, but he also comes up with this way of classifying plants called the sexual system, which caused a furor in places like, upper class England and so on. Basically looking how many pistils there are versus stamens. And these are various types of marriages, okay, according to Linnaeus. Okay? And so people are starting to move away from that. It's too limiting, right? And you can't just look at sexual characteristics and so forth. And so Rousseau developed this idea of a natural system. Okay, now this is a continental system, all right? And people are starting to come to that idea, all right? This is kind of what we do today, look at all the different morphological characteristics to identify species. In fact, today, we probably look more at the genomics, the genetics, and so on to identify things, okay? But the problem with that is even if you have the same genetic structure, the same genes and so on, a plant can express itself differently in different environments, even though they have the same genetic makeup. All right, so I throw this in here. Another way to look at this, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Great Devonian Controversy. It's a great book, okay? And it talks about how the argument about, what people were observing about this certain strata in Devonshire, okay, on the west coast of England, okay? And coming up, they knew about Silurian and some on other layers, but how do we come up with a Devonian period? So he basically talks about the process of making science like Latour talks about. Okay? It's a little different, but he talks about this. And so I put this up here as another way of, I mentioned that a lot of amateurs out there, okay, but you do have professionals, you have professional societies out there. So we can look at agents in the network, maybe on their memberships. I haven't done that, but that's another way to look at them. Okay, what memberships do they have? All right, so this is a flashback. Please pardon the low production values in this, but this is something out of my dissertation, okay? And this comes out of more of a spatial statistics, spatial analysis, having been to the University of Washington, home of the quantitative revolution back in the 60s. But this is an example of a static or structured space, okay? It's a network. It has X and Y coordinates and so on. And what I did was create these different types of arrangements, and then I created these different kinds of pathogens, okay? How infective are they, okay? How susceptible are the populations, and so on. And so I would run it thousands of times, come up with like average epidemics in different structured spaces, okay? And see how their patterns change and so on. And I used, you're seeing there's Quattro Pro. I don't know if any of you ever heard that. Use Excel today, but this is like in the late 80s, early 90s, okay? And some of it's hand-drawn, but in any case, came up with this. They ran 2,000 times like on a Mac or Macintosh. No, not on a Macintosh, take that back. On a PC, it was 386. It took 2 hours to run one of these, okay? And today it would take seconds, okay? But anyway, so the idea there is this is a structured space, and we're not looking at, what we'll be looking at is not so much a structured space, okay? It will be more fluid, okay, and open to interpretation. And here we can, come up with all kinds of statistics to make comparisons here, okay? I'm not going to go over that. But in any case, a table of statistics, we can say, this is a more spread out. We can say, give a numeric value, or this is more concentrated, and so on. Okay, so getting into more geography now, these are geographers here, Lowe and McCaughrean. Back in 2014, they looked at geosocial, the title of the article is Geosocial Visual Analytics. All right, so they put forth several ideas that relate to geography, okay, relating networks to geography. And some of this is kind of like overlapping in a way, kind of difficult to explain. We don't have to get too much detail about it, but there's this idea of social and network embeddedness. Okay, what's the influence of society and culture on the agents, okay? And then as they come together, their relationships, then how do they form a network, and how these networks become places, and how they may influence behavior, and how that behavior may also influence the place. This is some ideas they're putting forth. And so I know probably Ian has heard of Waldo Tobler, okay? And so Waldo Tobler came up with this first law of geography, okay? Very basic, okay? And there are apparently second laws and corollaries, but I don't remember them. Everything is related to everything else. Think about networks here. But else, everything else, but, should have a comma there probably, but near things are more related than distant things. Makes sense, right? Okay, if you look at your neighbor, you're like your neighbor, say in a neighborhood, right? Maybe the same kinds of jobs, same income, you know, it's almost predictable. Okay? But as you move away from where you are you're more different, okay? Not always the case, but that's the idea. And you can measure that kind of thing. But now we have nearness can be considered a matter of geographic and social network. We can combine the two. So moving on, some more, Christakis and Fowler, people shape their networks, and networks shape people, their behaviors. And networks have their own life, okay? They become inherent, all right? They affect our lives. And we have the study of networks, what they call grounded theory. It's just really you don't go in with any kind of theory. You just kind of like what I did, all right? You just start off with these people and see how they're connected and so on. And then maybe there's a theory behind that, okay? Or you can identify what's going on, create a theory to help explain what you're seeing. And so, and this is basically the process of what anybody like what I'm doing is contemplating. Okay? It's a recursive process in data collection, which I do, okay? And then I keep adding, subtracting. Oh, that person didn't live at that time, so how could they be connected, and so on. And then we're looking at connecting human experiences into broader experiences. And there can be multiple interpretations, and that's okay. Okay, it's an iterative process. And so it's important for situating knowledge and construction into both historical, geographical, and cultural contexts. All right, so networks. Science in action, how to follow scientists and engineers through society. It lends itself perfectly, this idea, to networks, network theory. Okay, so this Latour, he's basically said it's understandable, you know, it's best to look at science not as something already done, it's a fact, okay, but look at the process by which that fact was arrived at. And what the social context was, and what kind of technological things that they have, content, and the process, in the process of making facts, knowledge and truth, okay, and how various actors and materials are involved in forming a web, okay, and building a network. Then we have this concept that he brings up, centers of calculation, okay. So these are like hubs of activity. So you can identify one, Kew Gardens, for example. That would be, throughout since Joseph Banks, okay, sending people all over the place to collect plants and so forth, and bringing them back. And then over time, you have like William Hooker and Joseph Hooker, working on these plants, sending out more people, just collecting all over their imperial network, okay, just bringing all these things back, and then also disseminating them, all right? They were very interested in what can be grown, what couldn't be grown, acclimatizing, and so on. So that would be a good centers of calculation. Now it's easier to describe them in today's work, because many botanic gardens have these research arms associated with them. A lot of times plant preservation and so forth, conservation. Now, what is this? The Wardian case. This comes from the Kew Gardens. Wardian case, it's a botany game changer. Okay? So there's a link to it, but you can just type that in if you want, if you're so inclined. And what it was is this, you're traveling months, if not a year or so, on these ships, right? How do you keep plants alive? Okay? This innovation, okay, allowed plants to arrive in fairly good shape. A lot of times by the time they arrived, they'd be like pressed, but brown and so on. But you'd usually have an illustrator on board who would draw it, and then indicate what color should be there. And that is a whole nother area about how people dealt with colors back then. Okay, it's very interesting. Okay, but not here. Okay, but it gets into illustrators and so forth. So that's kind of a mock-up, all right, with these. They're various kinds, but that was a real innovation that allowed for more knowledge to be produced about plants. And then we have geography, place, and space, right? And then putting science in its place, geographies of scientific knowledge. And this guy, David Livingston, writes a lot about this kind of thing. Okay, very interesting stuff. And so where does science take place? Okay, throughout time, okay? There's curiosity cabinets. Wealthy people would build these buildings and structures to house whatever they collected. And so it didn't have to be plants, it could be animals, fossils, seashells, so on, minerals. And how does place influence, so it, you know, and then over time we begin to see laboratories, especially in the late 19th century, laboratory science, natural philosophy, okay, and institutions. And like today, okay, universities all over the world are known for certain things that they do in science. Those are places, okay. And how does place influence science? And are places associated with scientific endeavors? I read one thing like the Copenhagen School in physics, okay, is known for, I've never taken physics, so it's known for something about physics. And then is there a geography of response to scientific findings? All right, so think of what a big hit the Darwin was in the American South, okay? It helped in some places give justification, okay, if you look at social selection, okay, but justification of what was going on in the South, slavery and that kind of thing. And also, though, they're also very religious, okay, and so they would tend to think, well, you know, you take out the creator, you know, the divine fiat, how things are created, and you show us this process that takes millions of years, right, with God isn't a part of it, right? So, you know, the different areas, you wouldn't see this in, say, New York or Illinois for that matter. I mean, some people believe that, but, you know, overall, schools reflect that and so on. They teach you evolution. All right, so getting down to brass tacks, okay. So I talked about kind of the background and, you know, what was going on at the time. That was my idea anyway. And so if we get, how do we do this? How do we create these networks? Well, they're basically made up of nodes, okay, or actors, people, places, things, and edges. And edges can be flows of various kinds. But what can we have for nodes? Well, we can have different kinds of people practicing different things, whether they're collectors, taxonomists, could be faculty, could be illustrators. They could have a specialty. And back at this time, fungi were treated as plants, okay? And as were, well, we had mosses, lichens, ferns, okay? But they considered fungi along with those, they call them cryptograms, gams, hidden flowers. There's no, they couldn't find flowers on them, okay? So they must be hidden, right? Crypto. And then phanograms, they express some flowers, right? And so that's basically the two things that were going on. They talked about this all the way into the middle of the 19th century, maybe beyond, because in some places mycology is taught along with botany, okay? Even though fungi may be more closely related to animals than they are plants, depending on perspective. And then we have size of these connections. Okay, we can measure institutions or centers of calculation, could be a node. Botanical gardens, herbariums, also called botanical entrepôts collectively. And then objects, instruments, the Wardian case, for example, collecting materials, and herbaria, incidentals, paper, paints, because they would talk about what would you recommend as a microscope to each other. That could be overseas, you know, what would you think about this? And what is the best paper for preserving plants? Okay, and how do you do this, and so forth? Okay, well, they communicate those things along with gossip, and sometimes not very nice gossip, but in any case, they. So it would be very hard. I could go through letters. I've gone through them, and they talk about all kinds of things. So the only thing you can really do is maybe count how many letters or whatever they're sending as flows along these edges. I haven't done that yet, not comprehensively. So you could categorize these letters into various things, and then we could weight them by letter category, how many, and then we can have weights also of quantities of material sent and received. So we have this flow of objects, okay? It could be all kinds of things, all right? And so you can input data into Gephi, with 2 Excel spreadsheets. Okay, that's where the fun begins. Okay, and one for defining those and one for defining edges. Okay, which is actually a paired list, and that's what they look like in Excel. I have Schaumburg up there. Okay, Schaumburg has an ID. Okay, and there's all kinds of things I put in there. I can keep expanding it. You know, I should have used Australasia then rather than Oceania, but too late now. But anyway, I classified different kinds of locations, and location 3 is really who I started off with, which was Burns. Okay, back he was on the Brown. I'm sorry, Robert Brown. He was on the Investigator with Matthew Flinders. Okay, so I start off with him. He's a big guy. Okay, although he ends up he's in England. Okay, but he contributed a lot. And then and so I have Schaumburg in there from my reading here. Okay, you know, when I first saw Schaumburg, I actually was going through the AI list. I go, is that spelled right? You know, and so on. But it is, and of course, and so I had no idea what his position was here in South Australia, or Adelaide for that matter, in the Botanic Garden. I do now. Okay, that's very interesting, I think. So anyway, they are ID'd by number, and then I just take these numbers, okay, who matches up with who, okay, that I know is connected to these persons. So I have like 175 nodes, okay, stretching all over the globe. And then I have like 350 connections from this, okay. Gephi is able to take this and create networks of this information. This is what it does. Okay. Explore, analyze, spatialize, okay. Filter, cluster, manipulate, export, can work with all kinds of networks. Now, I don't believe geographers designed this. I think they are French sociologists that came up with this many years ago, okay. It is free though, all right, and it takes a little getting used to working, but it works pretty well when you know what you're doing, okay. And you can always go to YouTube. There are things in there about YouTube, but it does spatialize in terms of, oh, I can put a geographic coordinate there and I can map that, okay. But what's coming out, and which I'm going to be translating pretty soon, is this program. I belong to this group about networks, geographic networks, and it's a program that does work on spatialized or testing, okay, looking at geography, looking at analytical geography in these networks. Okay, there's all kinds of ways that you can look at things, okay. So this is what we come up with. Now, I'm also a member of the, what is it, Society for the, well, anyway, Historical Natural History, or the History of Natural History group, okay? And they have a journal comes out twice a year. And while I was sitting there scratching my head about this thing, because I didn't want to rewrite a program about networks and so on, so I was done with that. I wanted to focus on actually doing the network stuff. And so I found these guys use Gephi, right? So I'll give that a try, all right? So what they did is they looked at, like, you know, I don't have them. Let's see how well this does. Very barely. Okay, so they look at one guy, like I do in many instances, Richard Thomas Lowe, who's on the island of Madeira. And these are all the people he was connected to, different types. There's a legend here, all right? And all throughout, it's kind of limited in a way, but he was connected to India. And what I have circled here is where his people, okay, that he has in here, connect with my people, okay, in North America, all right? And so these, although they were in England, they communicated with the person that I was looking at, okay, especially Miles Joseph Berkeley, who was also a clergy person in England, okay, but was also known for being an expert in fungi. People would send him things. People are very interested in fungi. For what reason? They damage crops. Okay. So the one guy that I work with here at the beginning, Curtis, okay, Moses Ashley Curtis, he went by Ashley, didn't like the word name Moses. And so he communicated with him quite a bit, but also with Southerners, okay, who had plantations and who were concerned about mycological damage, fungi, and so on. And so I take, this is this guy, okay, Moses Ashley Curtis. That's an old picture I got out of Biodiversity Heritage Library. And I just start my network, kind of mimicking what was done before. And there he is. I put him down more as a mycologist, botanist, and the people he communicated with are in blue, pretty much. Yeah, they're all there. They're kind of close, though, okay? So you can measure all this closeness. All right, and so you can look at ego subnets, okay? You can take apart that network, okay? And look at, the major players. And here I use like 2 degrees, okay? I may not be directly connected to that person. You probably heard 6 degrees or whatever that is about, neighborhood. And you can find somebody after 6 degrees, all right, that, all throughout the world, right? This only goes to 2 degrees, okay? Friends of friends, basically. And Facebook is also, a great example of networks. But anyway, so there's our guy, Moses Ashley Curtis on the left, and again, where he connects with people in that previous network from that article, okay? Now, so, well, it's all about men. It seems like there's all these old white guys are doing this, right? So I thought, well, I know women were involved in this. It's just they don't get much airtime, all right? But they were very involved in actually geographic education at the time and also botany. Botany or natural history is very important in education, at least in the United States in the beginning of the 19th century. Because it was teaching this idea, we're a new nation now. We need to look and see what we've got, classify it, understand it. We need to make maps. You need to know your maps, where we are in the place in the world, and so on. And women were doing this, okay, and they became school teachers, and they influenced a lot of people that way. Natural history, these plant collections, students who make plant collections, they were doing this kind of thing. My own kids in North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, part of their high school project was to collect leaves of plants, okay? And so they put a stop to it because I think people got tired of all these teenagers rampaging through their yards, tearing off leaves and things, okay? And so they stopped it actually, but it had been going on all that time. It was a tradition. Anyway, so I use Claude AI for this, okay? So well, can you find me a female botanist or an illustrator, okay? And so they came up with this, Ellen Hutchins, okay? And very little is actually known by her except for some descendants who wrote about her. But she became a very well-known illustrator, but she didn't put her name on anything. So it's very hard to tell. Only the people that she dealt with directly knew that she had drawn these things, okay? And she would send them specimens and, want to know how best to send these specimens, but it wasn't very far. It was actually a fairly local network. And this was going on right around 1800, okay? So it's very early. But no one knows what she looked like either, okay? But this is obviously the period of Jane Austen, okay? You can kind of tell, right? Okay, so anyway, so she did have a botanical network, actually, all right? So I made one, all right? But it was very localized, and there's some other women in there that were also illustrators and so forth. But the big players were Dawson Turner, read a biography of him. He was a banker, but he was also a collector and an antiquarian. And he wrote books, okay, about seaweeds and so forth, because that's what she collected. She lived by the shore in southwest Ireland, okay? And so he wrote about her work, and she did not live very long. She never reached her 30th birthday, okay? Never married. She took care of her family and this kind of thing, very local area. People would come and visit her. Her work was so well known, at least in Ireland and in England. So Dawson Turner really kind of promoted her in these endeavors, but there are others showing her how to draw better and so on, illustrate. And today, this is the network, okay? I've used Google Earth because it's a little bit better than Gephi comes up with, at least in my mind, okay? So this is her network from Gephi, okay? And then on the website, they already have a network, okay? I found this a little bit later. Now the thing is, she's celebrated now, okay? She's on the map, her place. People come to where she lives, and every August they have this celebration. They have illustration or painting classes. They have hiking tours where Ellen went and so on, all right? And at that time, seaweeds were the rage. You go back to the cactus, okay, and succulents were the rage, at least for some people. But here, seaweeds were, okay? And I got this actually from New York Botanical Garden. Her work is spread all over the place, okay? New York Botanical Garden has some examples of this. And those are the kinds of things she drew. Though that there on the right-hand side is from Dawson Turner's book showing a picture, one of her illustrations. And these are communications, okay, I think with Dawson Turner. I forget what this is called, but how they would write across, okay, some of these letters. 90 degrees, I don't know how they could read it, but they used to do that, right? Okay, so these are the materials I used, okay? Even here, okay? And I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end, what I did here too. But these are the kinds of things, people too, groups that encouraged me or gave me information. All right, so here we are. Now, what we're doing here is this is everybody, okay, everybody, with the Australians added in, okay? So now it's like a pretty big, messy network, okay? And so what I did is kind of identified them on this sociograph, all right? And so I have Ellen Hutchins there, okay, in the black dash. Okay, and the orange is my original network, MAC, okay, Moses Ashley Curtis. And then the light blue is more or less the Robert Brown network, okay, which is a little bit older, but these all overlap in one way or another in terms of time and space too. Okay, that's a Geffey approach to where everybody is, okay? It's a global network, 19th century global. Here I just sort of expand locally, okay, where these people are. Charles Darwin does not reside in the North Sea there. That's an error in the latitude. I corrected that, but it's not on here. So he would be down, okay, near London, okay, suburb of London now, I guess. But here's Robert Brown, okay, he's a big player. The size of the circle means degree, okay, how many connections they have. He has a lot, okay. And then here's my Eastern Seaboard U.S., okay, and all the lines, a lot of them are going to Europe. Some even go to Australia, believe it or not, okay. Von Mueller, okay, and I'll show you in a minute, but yesterday I was like, I divided these up into sub-networks, right, by place, okay, or by when I put them in. And I know Von Mueller's a pretty big guy. I mean, he should be in this network, right? But no, I already had him in the American network, okay, early on. Okay, Von Mueller's very big. I haven't really gotten to him much, but he adds a lot if you're looking at collectors and so on, because he had armies of collectors, women mostly, collectors all throughout Australia, okay? And the Sydney Botanic Garden has people there who have written about all this. Okay, now real quick, what happens here is that we see these connections. A lot of people are educated in the North, but they work for, at some point they would become like tutors, okay? Like my guy, Moses Ashley Curtis, he was a tutor for a family in Wilmington, North Carolina, okay? And so, of course, typical, he falls in love with the daughter right there, and then they get married and so on, and he becomes an Episcopal priest and so forth, okay? And he's working at getting better and better. A lot of them, coming down the south, working as doctors and so on, going down to the south. Okay, I'm getting almost done here. Okay, and this is the results for Australasia, okay? And way on the left is Schomburg, okay? More work needs to be done on that, okay? But these are the connections, a lot of them that he had. Of course, Von Mueller's in here too as well. And then here I'm doing more of the analytics. These are all kind of the big players. Again, this is the entire network. And we can measure the density of what I have here, the connections, okay? And there's Von Mueller, botanist and geographer, okay? And his density, graph density, all right, is pretty high, okay? And yeah, okay. I'm going through these different measures for different botanists, okay? And then I have a graph that summarizes all this, okay? So basically the lower the density, okay, it's more spread out, they're more connected, but they're far afield. And then path length is, each path is one, but how many ones do you have? And that's kind of a proportion. The degree is how concentrated you are, and then the degree of clustering within, you know, how embedded are your nodes, your other people that you're connected to in the network. And then speeding up, okay, I do here talk about post-independent science in the US. I've mentioned some of that already. Ireland and seaweeds, okay, very localized network, and then colonial network, okay, is a collection of networks and economic botany emphasis. And they're using, very different than the US situation because it's based a lot on the imperial network, Britain and other networks in the Europe. And then these are kind of my discussion and conclusions, my attempt at seeing the forest through the trees, but I'm not so sure I did that great of a job. But, you know, I found many of these things are kind of true, okay, that what we talked about in the beginning, okay, more work on the nature of communications among actors needs to be done and so forth. And then those are the kinds of references that I had. And real quick, what's going on today? So this is what Northern Illinois, where I live, looks like, okay? Used to be tall grass prairie, all for crops, large acreages of corn and soybean, okay? And this is what we're trying to do now, restore tall grass prairie, okay? So there's a network of people doing this, network of communities and so on. Even farmers are selling off parts of their land or getting tax credits to restore land back to this, okay? And this is sort of the outcome of all the things that were going on back in the 19th century. And then there's a game on networks, okay, botany. Okay. I just came across this. It's like, really? So you can, you know, go out and collect, okay, or you can, you know, sell them or give them to different people and so forth. So I kind of had to review it. I always tend to do a little bit too long on the very beginning, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you.